Notes.
Mhm.
Well, Dilip, welcome back to In Search of Wisdom.
Thank you, Josh. Pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. I'm appreciative of your time. It's been a few years since you've been on, and
Mhm.
I'm excited to chat about your book, Wiser Again, but also more specifically, maybe the topic of wise elders.
Mhm.
But before we get into that, could you refresh the listeners with a little bit of your, work and interests?
Sure. So, so I'm Dilip Jeste. I was born and raised in India. I went to medical school there, and I really got interested in psychiatry. I moved to the US uh, mainly for doing more research. I wanted to go to NIH, which I did. I was there for several years. Then I moved to San Diego, and I was on the faculty of University of California, San Diego for about 30 years. I retired 2 years ago, and I'm now actually even more busy than I was before. I'm working more at an international level. I am now president-elect of the World Federation for Psychotherapy, and I have started a global research network on social determinants of health.
Mm, nice, nice. Well, that's wonderful. Congratulations on the recent retirement, and then also some new exciting projects. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Um, could you talk a bit about your interest in wisdom? You know,
Sure.
when people hear psychiatry and things like that, and we don't always, connect the dots with wisdom. So, how did your interest start there?
Sure. So as I said, I was raised and brought up in India, and like many Eastern cultures, the belief there has been that older people are to be respected, and that is because they are wiser. And the Indian scripture, which was written thousands of years BCE, is called Gita. It's like the Indian Bible, if you would. And it is really a compendium on wisdom throughout life. So I was brought up in that culture, thinking that there is such a thing as wisdom and older people are wiser. But I really didn't think about that from any other perspective until about 20 years ago. So after coming to the US and moving to San Diego, I became a geriatric psychiatrist. And a number of my friends said, "Why are you doing that? Because it must be so depressing. Aging is all gloom and doom, and mental illnesses are a life sentence. You can't recover from them." And I said, "No, that's not actually what I grew up with thinking. I thought that actually older people are wiser." Uh, and in my own research on serious mental illnesses in older people, I found that people who survived into later life actually started doing better in their older age. Their symptoms went down. Some of you have seen the movie Beautiful Mind. True story of a Nobel laureate who developed schizophrenia, was diagnosed with schizophrenia in his early 20s. And for 30 years, he was in and out of hospital, got electric shock therapy, and you name it, and he got it. At 50, he started getting better. At 60, he went back to doing research, teaching. And I saw that in my own work also, that people with schizophrenia improve. And we did a study of population at large, community based, and we found that with age, the physical health declines, but the mental health improves. And that made me wonder whether there is such a thing as increase in wisdom with aging. And most of the focus of aging research actually has been on diseases of aging. But I really got interested in healthy aging, successful aging. And but the question was then, how do you study wisdom? You have to look at wisdom as a scientific entity. And the hardcore scientists don't really like this kind of fuzzy constructs. like wisdom. They didn't like consciousness, for example. For centuries, they dismissed consciousness as a philosophical, psychological construct. Today, we know the neurobiology of consciousness. Same thing with emotions, stress, resilience. And I thought that wisdom was something similar, that people are dismissing it from research, saying it's a fuzzy construct, but maybe real scientific. Empirical research on wisdom started in the 1970s at Max Planck Institute in Berlin and also in University of Southern California, San Diego, and that research has been growing. But not too many psychiatrists or neuroscientists are involved in that research until now. And I thought that's something I really needed to do. So that is how I got interested in studying wisdom as a scientific entity to understand how we can define it, how we can measure it, what is its biology, how can we improve it. So that's where the concept of wisdom as related to aging started.
Beautiful. I'm obviously fascinated with the topic a bit. It's the reason I started this thing called In Search of Wisdom, to connect with people like yourself and ask all sorts of curiosity questions. Um, I don't know. Sometimes, I guess to reflect a bit, I probably started this just north of 40, kind of spent my whole life in traditional education type of stuff. Um, and then coming to a bit of realization, I'm not exactly sure how. Maybe I came across a good book of my own ignorance, my own just lack of understanding of even what wisdom is, much less becoming wiser or anything like that. So like sometimes as a like looking at society, you look at things and there's obviously always problems, at any point in time throughout history. But I don't know, I tend to think like wisdom is the antidote in a way to many of the problems. I'm not saying everything is unnecessary suffering and all of that. I don't want to take it like too far, but wow, like wisdom is it seems like the most important, least talked about word in in our culture.
You know, I couldn't agree with you more. And this is based on actually research and evidence. So it's not just a philosophical or moral idea about wisdom, that wisdom is an antidote to bad things that are happening. Um, we have published several empirical studies of hundreds of people. Actually, I would say it's a few thousand people, in which we have found that wisdom, which includes compassion as a very important component, it is at the exact opposite end of loneliness and the associated things. So loneliness has been a behavioral pandemic in the US and rest of the world for the last 20 years. People don't realize that. When we think about pandemic, it is COVID. And in the past, there were pandemics of smallpox and other infectious diseases, tuberculosis, leprosy, and what have you. Last 20 years, the overall function of the society has gone down. Health actually has gone down. In the US, average lifespan fell before COVID. People don't know that. It has been increasing continuously since 1950s, but it began dropping in 2016-17, and the reason was loneliness related conditions. So loneliness is associated with increase in hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, depression. Also, increase in the deaths of despair from suicides, drug-related deaths like opioid use-related deaths. Suicide has increased something like 30%, and suicide opioid-related deaths have increased tenfold in the last 10-12 years. And so this is really a behavioral pandemic. And I think people are now becoming aware at a larger level also. The World Health Organization has said that this is really a major crisis for the whole population. And our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, he published a book on that and also talked about importance of loneliness. But the good news is that we have an antidote for that, and that is wisdom. Wisdom, which includes compassion, empathy, emotional regulation, self-reflection, acceptance of diverse perspectives, spirituality. Again, this is based on empirical research. Even we did a longitudinal study over a period of 7 years, and we found that people who had higher level of compassion and wisdom at baseline, they were much less likely to become lonely 7 years later compared to people who didn't have that. Going beyond that, we even found biological opposition between the two. We published a study on EEG, electroencephalography, and a study of gut microbiome. Gut microbiome was more healthy in people with higher levels of compassion and wisdom, but it was quite unhealthy in people with loneliness.
Mm.
So we have a major societal problem, no question about that. But we have a potential solution, but we need to do something about that.
Mm. I really appreciate that. How do you think about the notion of holding these different things at one time? Like you talked about emotional regulation, compassion, and you could go on in terms of these components of wisdom that you write about. But it seems so difficult for us to like hold the whole web of what it is. You even think, you could connect it with things like discipline and flexibility, as you mentioned, in terms of openness and things like that. How are you thinking about today in the way of just developing the capacity to hold multiple things at one time that are, all important?
That's a very good question. I would say the single most important thing for humanity is very good social connections. Social connections is really the unifying feature. Our species, Homo sapiens, by the way, Homo sapiens literally means wise man. So it included wisdom. But we are a social species, and for us to survive, we must have very good social connections. And again, numerous studies have shown, hundreds of studies have shown that good social connections increase longevity by 50%. There is no other factor in entire medicine, any drug, any other intervention comes even close to increasing longevity by that much. So social connections are very critical. And social connections, I don't mean the number of connections. A college student who lives in a dorm with hundreds of other students and has 1,000 Facebook friends is not in the best position. He is actually
Yeah.
likely to be very lonely, depressed, suicidal even. So what is important is the quality of social connections. And what wisdom does, especially compassion part of that, is to improve the quality of our relationship with others. And so that it starts even in the family. So marital status, being married or having a partner with good relationship, has been repeatedly shown to be critical for healthy living. Same thing about then connections in which there is mutually compassionate relationship. And other components of wisdom are often essential for that kind of relationship. For example, control over our emotions. That doesn't mean not having emotions, not at all. But it doesn't mean that we should all the time be fluctuating between very high happiness to very sadness to great anger and hatred. That really doesn't help us. So we need emotional regulation. We need self-reflection, ability to look inwards, understand ourselves, improve our errors, accepting diversity of perspectives. is essential for good social relationships. And that's an important component of wisdom. Today, we are living in a very polarized world. And not just US, but actually the rest of the world also.
Hmm.
Uh, really, our polarization has been increasing, and not just in politics, but in other areas too. And that is causing loneliness because of that. So these are the factors that actually combine together in wisdom. And they are closely related. And they're really necessary for improving social connections, which we have to have for the human species to survive.
It it brings up a bit of challenges, in the way of, and you talk about relationships and the way of ships, friendships, um, the need for these wisdom, or you could say wisdom skills, maybe the need for them, like for healthy relationships. Um, Now, and I'm curious to transition into this idea of like wise elders. I think sometimes when we think of wise elders, maybe we think of like hunter-gatherer communities, and there's, such a thing as a few wise elders and things like that. Um, I don't know. How can we tap into the wisdom of wise elders, for listeners out there? Because oftentimes when you think of, say, relationship problems, which can be, you know, I'm married to a wonderful woman, and it's still like challenging because I am unwise. Because I bring, when you were talking about all these things of being open and all sorts of stuff, I'm not obviously always that. So my ignorance that I bring to it even like amplifies the challenges. Um, but you go to, say, marriage counselor, whatever may be, and it's not. I don't know. It seems to me like there would be big differences between going to some sort of wise elder that knows maybe something about you, something about your culture. Um, I don't know. Any thoughts there, Dilip?
Sure. A couple of points I want to make at the beginning. One is that nobody is perfect. So there is nobody who would have all the time the highest level of compassion and emotional regulation and self-reflection and accept. No, it is not possible. Human life is difficult. Things sometimes crises occur, disasters occur through no fault of ours. And we are bound to react to that. So I don't think the expectation would be that somebody would be perfect all the time. There is no way. And so we have to accept the fact and accept ourselves also that we are not going to be perfect all the time, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that we are not wise. The other thing is that when I talk about increase in wisdom with aging, aging is very heterogeneous. People age differently. Not everybody ages in the same way. So when we talk about increase in wisdom with aging, that's a general statement that doesn't apply to everybody. There are some older people who are very unwise and some young people who are very wise. So it's not a one-to-one relationship between age and wisdom, right? Also, wisdom is not something yes or no. It is how much of wisdom does one have. So
Hmm.
it's really, um, so it's a personality trait. Uh, that means it's a characteristic pattern of behavior. Trait like resilience, optimism, even extroversion, introversion. And so everybody has some of that, right? So we are not talking about dividing people into wise and unwise. No, everybody has wisdom to varying extent, and that extent would vary across lifetime. And also it would vary within the components of wisdom. Some people may be quite compassionate, but not have good control over their emotions, and so on and so forth. So I think once we lower those kinds of expectations, I think then we can start to understand what happened. So as we get older, um, the experience teaches us lots of things. And that is what often helps people become wiser. Again, it doesn't apply to everybody. Some people, after experience, they actually may become more unwise, but by and large, most of us, uh, because we learn through experience. To give actually an example that may come as a surprise to many people, when the COVID started, the and the requirement for social isolation came into being in order to stop the spread of infection. Among geriatric psychiatrists, there is a big concern that older people are going to do terribly poorly because, as it is, they don't have too many social connections. They don't have usually much technology, so they don't use FaceTime or things like that, and they don't use social media, unlike younger people. So, younger people will do well, but older people will not. You know what the finding was? Exact opposite. People between 18 and 25 were shown to be 5 times more likely than people over 65 in terms of depression, anxiety, and perceived stress. This was a paper published in one of the JAMA journals. So it is really not some feel-good TV science, real empirical data. Why did that happen? So younger people had social connections. Well, but the quality of connections was a problem. And they got worse during this period of stress. Whereas older people, they had solid connection, the quality of connections, even though they had fewer connections. So that is what a wise elder mean, that older people, and why it happened, because for many younger people, this was the first crisis in their life. Something like that. People in their, say, people who are 18, 19, 20, COVID was very different from anything that they had experienced in their lifetime. Older people, they had gone through much severe stresses. They had gone, depending on where they were, they had gone through wars, floods, droughts, economic depression, terrorist attacks, you name it. And they survived. So they knew that they were going to survive from COVID too, right? And so that is what makes people wiser with age through the experience, the way they handle the experience.
Mm. That's really helpful and such an important point. It seems like it's easy for us to forget. Um, I'm curious to touch on the final chapter of your book, where you get into from individual to societal wisdom, and you touch on some of those surveys that people have probably heard of like the happiest countries, um, and it makes me wonder in the way of the connection between happiness and wisdom. Is it possible that a study like that does reveal, something related to wisdom?
Yes, actually, I do think so. Again, the studies, they need to be done properly. I think when we talk about happiness or well-being for that matter,
Yeah.
some people don't often realize that there are at least two types of happiness or well-being. One is called hedonic well-being, another is called eudaimonic well-being. So I'll tell you. So hedonic well-being is something we all talk about. That's a happiness. If I make more money, I'm happier. And there is hedonic treadmill. If I want to make $1 million to make myself happy. When I have 1 million, then I want to have 2 million. So I'm not happy till then I want to 3 million, and so on. It's a never-ending expectation of materialistic happiness. That is what I need in the hedonic well-being or hedonic happiness. And many of the studies actually talk about that kind of happiness. That's a problem with those
Mm.
studies.
Yeah.
There is something else opposite, or not opposite, but at least different, that is called eudaimonic well-being. This is the word that was first used by Aristotle. So, what is eudaimonic? Eudaimonic means your happiness or well-being is connected not only to how you feel and how you do, but also how other people feel and do, other people whom you know. They're part of your life. Again, human society is humans are a human society, that we have friendships, colleagues, our groups, our family, community. They are all important. For people who have a purpose in life, who not only want to make themselves happy, they want to make their near and dear ones happy, and that number increases whom they want to make happy. So that is the eudaimonic well-being. In the sense, it includes not only personal happiness, but also happiness of the loved near and dear ones, and that so that group can increase. So where your job is not only make yourself happy, but also make others happy. So that kind of eudaimonic well-being is very much associated with wisdom. Because, right, I mean, wisdom, I said, it includes compassion, empathy, control over emotions, self-reflection, accepting diversity of perspectives, all of those things. If you do those, they make you happy. Again, nobody's happy all the time. It cannot be. There are some disasters that occur, right? But you recover from that. And then you go back to where you were and where you want to be. That's a kind of happiness that can continue for a long time. Unlike the hedonic happiness just depending on how much materialistic goods I have, that will never be complete because always I will want more. So and there are actually some Gallup poll studies of this eudaimonic well-being, and they have shown that actually that kind of well-being is associated with greater GDP, gross domestic product. So we need to have that, not just for moral or ethical purposes, but even from the economic perspective, financial perspective, for the growth of the society.
Yeah. And it seems like that type of happiness, this eudaimonic, um, can exist while experiencing some sort of sadness, what we might call, negative emotions and things like that. Um, I'm also curious in the way of happiness and maybe happiness is definitely not the right word as we've been talking about. But when we talk about compassion and like to bring in happiness as well, there's lots of just terrible things going on in the world, like wars, violence, people suffering, multiple locations throughout the world. We can have, and we are wise to. It's a heartbreaking thing. But sometimes we can think compassion, like it has to lead to some sort of action. It has to be, something that, it's within our little circle of control or something like that. But in a way, to go through a long, rambling question here, like in a way, it kind of saddens us in a way. It's like knowing and getting a bit of insight and awareness to the, conditions that other people are living in. You could think in some of the Buddhist philosophy stuff, I've heard a guest talk about, happiness is like maybe an extreme example that sticks in my mind, like licking honey off of a razor blade. It's this thing, how happy can we be as connected individuals to this whole thing, in the midst of, kind of the never ending, seemingly, challenges that we face.
Your point is very well taken. I mean, it really becomes hard in times like this. So many things going on, and you feel helpless. You want to do something, and what can you do? Uh, I think so. There are again different ways of looking at it. One is that let us do the thing that we have control over, and that can be helpful to others. And also, there is going to be inevitable differences of opinion. And I think it is important so that's one of the components of wisdom, is accepting diversity of perspectives is critical. I think what happens often in such cases is people have very strong opinions, and anybody who thinks differently must be either evil or dumb. That's not necessarily the case, that people can have logically very different perspectives based on their background and the thing that happened to them, what they see happen to their loved ones, so on and so forth. And we should accept the fact that different people can have different perspectives. That doesn't make them enemies of ours. And so when we talk about compassion, it also includes self-compassion. You have to be compassionate toward yourself. So once we accept our limitations, also what can we do? There's not too much we can do for something that are happening far away, or even if they happen here. Because of our physical strength and skills and so on, there are only some things we can do, some things we cannot, right? The other positive way, though, I think it's really important for people to think about is, if you go through the human history, you find that there were many other periods when things were disastrous. If you just think about the Second World War, things couldn't have been worse in so many ways. When it was going on, the Holocaust and, fights between, and then the countries that were winning the war in the beginning, in the early 40s, were not the ones who should have won. And yet it really looked very depressing at that time. Of course, I was not born there, so I don't know. But I'm sure that many people felt very depressed. They thought that the world was coming to an end. There's nothing one could do. But it changed. Ultimately, good things happened. It ended. And then in the 50s, we established United Nations, World Health Organization, UNESCO for children. And it would have been unimaginable in the 1940s, early 1940s, what happened in the mid 1950s. So we should keep in mind those circumstances also. That same thing will happen. And actually, it's not a question of, it has to happen for us to survive. Because if the things start getting worse, and if there's a nuclear war, the humanity will come to an end. And so hopefully, and very likely, I think people are still, they want to survive, and they want their loved ones to survive. So hopefully and likely we'll come out of that. And still there will be similar conflicts 100 years from now, so on and so forth. So I think we should, and that is what makes older people wiser in a way, because they have been through that. They experience that. For younger people, that's not the case. So but we do need that kind of positive attitude right now. I really think it is important, because I think what is happening right now is not good for our health. There's 24/7 bad news. And globalization and technology have been great in so many ways. But the big downside of both globalization and technology is this 24/7 bad news. The main headlines are something bad happening in any part of the world. That's what makes the headline. If there is an earthquake, war, terrorism, flood, tsunami, that becomes the top news. We don't talk about good things happening anywhere. And constantly, and of course, the world is so large, bad things are bound to happen someplace. But that makes us feel down and reduces the well-being. It reduces optimism. It makes us pessimistic. There's nothing we can do. But we should think about the fact that this always was the case. It is only now we know about them. But before technology and globalization, still bad things happen in some part of the world or not. So it's a question of how we handle them. And that's where, again, wisdom would come into play in terms of having more emotional regulation, thinking about what we can do to help others, help ourselves, etc. So I feel we have to have that kind of positive attitude.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an important point of It reminds me of the Delphic maxim, nothing to excess, where you think of nonstop news cycle, whatever it may be, but like there is wisdom in the idea of thinking of others, this, thoughts and prayers that, are beyond yourself, widening our circles of compassion. Um, but then to the excess where it's like all consuming, and we can't necessarily like turn off the news, then and like that gets back to this thing of wisdom and things like love, are many things, and how can we hold this big web of many things as we, navigate our path in life. Um, easier said than done, obviously, but like you say, it's, it's on a spectrum. Um, I'm wondering if maybe you could put on the psychiatry hat if you don't always wear it. Let me let me ask a question about humility, and maybe more specifically, it's about ignorance. So, on this spectrum of wisdom, we may not be, especially in all areas and all components and things like that, at the highest levels of wisdom, obviously. Um, what are your thoughts on just becoming aware of our own ignorance? Like, as you were talking about in the way of nobody's perfect, you know, but how do we come to accept it? Ignorance is maybe another word that you don't hear a lot about. Um, and maybe there's a better word, you can share it if you have a better word. But, how do you think about just becoming aware of that?
Again, an excellent point. Humility is actually essential for wisdom. Socrates said that anybody who thinks he is wise is a fool, because a wise person knows how much he doesn't know. So, humility is an essential, uh, because you have to realize how much you don't know, and that shouldn't make you feel bad or depressed or inferior. No, everybody has. Nobody know. There is not even we can even go close to knowing even 10% of the things in the world, let alone knowing everything. And also, people make decisions that sometimes they are right, but they prove to be totally wrong at other times. So there is no single person who makes right decisions all the time and somebody who makes bad decisions all the time. And but that's how often people think that whatever I do or people I like they do is right. Whatever somebody I don't like and that group, whatever they do is wrong, because their decisions are going to have bad impact. We don't know that yet. We never know that. The future is so unpredictable, right? So humility is critical to actually reduce eventual grief and sadness, which is inevitable. Again, there are times when things will go wrong. And just like one shouldn't blame yourself every time things go wrong, you shouldn't necessarily take credit when things go right. You can't say this is because I knew everything and that's I made the right decision. No, I mean, you're lucky also. Luck plays a lot of role in what happens, just like bad luck plays a role when things go wrong. And so there are so many things which are totally beyond our control in the world. Again, and we should realize that with globalization, we can see that how, there are totally unpredictable outcomes on so many things. Understanding that is humility.
Hmm.
And humility doesn't mean excessive modesty. I mean, I don't also want people to think that, oh no, I don't know anything. I'm always wrong. I must go with. No, I mean, as we grow older, we get some knowledge, we get some experience. And so that again, wise elder that you mentioned, older people have more experience. So they would come to a conclusion that is more likely to be correct than that of a person who hasn't had experience. But that doesn't mean they will always be right. They can also be wrong, or the younger
Hmm.
person can be right. So one does need that kind of humility on both sides, especially at younger age when you don't have much experience. Uh, Again, so this is sort of openness to new ideas, openness to changes, and so in a way it's sort of included in emotional regulation and self-reflection, as well as acceptance of diverse perspectives. Humility is associated with those things, and I mean, I think that's almost it is essential for us to do well in life.
Yeah, it's I'm thinking of maybe going to a particular older, wiser person with whatever circumstance you might be dealing with. They might help to bring in more uncertainty, nuance of the situation. It's like humility, that's another word. It seems like it webs out and connects with these other words and practices and things like that, which is maybe often what we don't want to hear. We want like more certainty. We want to go with some sort of, you think of people on YouTube that are often do really well. There's a lot of certainty. There's a lot of not a lot of nuance sometimes when people are talking about how to do things.
You're right. Actually, I was just thinking about that. You're absolutely right. I think that one thing that is happening right now also is that the modern culture, especially modern Western culture, it very much emphasizes and teaches young people the importance of self-confidence. And that's actually often a priority for groups. And I mean, obviously, you have to have some self-confidence, otherwise, you can't do anything. But extreme self-confidence is as bad as not having enough confidence. So it is actually even our educational system where there are strong beliefs in something. Uh, just like, for example, and that's where we run into problems. When you go to one extreme, we find the downside of that. For example, in schools, in the education, uh, there are some fixed standards that have been used for decades. SAT scores, for example, or for medical schools, there's MCAT score, and so on. So every um, profession, there is some requirement needed for the skills in that particular field. And that's nothing wrong with that. That's good. Actually, you need to have those. But they can't be the final one, or they can't be the only uh, way of assessing who would do well. That's much broader. And people need to know that. So just because I got the highest score in MCAT doesn't mean I'm going to be the best physician. No, very likely not. So that kind of, I think, humility is essential. So it's really a combination of confidence. We do need to have some self-confidence, otherwise we can't survive. But it needs to be controlled by humility, which comes from knowledge of a lot that we don't know. So it's a
Yeah,
balance here.
yeah, and it seems like in a way, like we could completely flip it in a way. It seems like a paradox to us in the way knowledge of what we do not know is that, it's the same thing you were talking about in the way of we don't have to feel bad about, our own ignorance, these things we don't quite understand and don't have wisdom. We could actually feel good about it because it's something we're now aware of. And before we were, it was in the dark to it. So it's an interesting thing. Um, as we start to wrap up, I wanted to get your thoughts on what's called the meaning crisis. Sometimes, maybe different names. There's like a connection crisis in the way of all sorts of isolation and loneliness. But I'm curious your thoughts in the way of wise elders, helping us navigate as a society this, collection of, at least here, here in the West, of what's called the meaning crisis.
Again, very well made point. I think meaning, so there should be meaning to life. There should be a purpose in life. And again, this is based on empirical research. Numerous empirical studies have shown that having a meaning or purpose in life is associated with better health and greater longevity. And so when you look at what happens to meaning across the lifespan, in the teenagers, of course, we are just struggling to find out what is the meaning to what we do. And that continues in the 20s, when actually there's a struggle to find the meaning, because you are thinking about what are you going to do? Are you going to continue education? If so, in what field? Are you going to take a job? In which field? Are you going to have a partner, life partner, or marry or not? Where do you settle down? And there's a lot of peer pressure. You compare yourself with peers and you always feel you're not doing well. So there's a lack of meaning or purpose at the time for most people. Again, not everybody, but for most people. As we grow older, 30s, 40s, I think the things begin to settle down some. So you have chosen a profession or occupation. You are married or have a partner, you have a family or close connection, group, friend. And so you actually have now meaning and people are happier till you reach older age, 50, 60. Suddenly then actually things begin to change. One, because you start developing physical illnesses. So you don't know what you are going to do. Loved ones die or they become very sick. There are other crises that happen. And sometimes people are forced to retire because of the government regulations or whatever the rules are, wherever, or for whatever reason. And that becomes very stressful, especially for men who are been doing a job, because their purpose is to do the job. And when the job disappears, the purpose disappears. So it is really important to have some purpose, and the purpose need not be same throughout life. It can change, and there's nothing wrong with that. But especially in middle age and later life, having some purpose that is meaningful. And again, going back to eudaimonic well-being, hedonic, the only purpose is to make more money or get bigger house or more car. No, that's not going to help you, definitely. The eudaimonic, and eudaimonic, by the way, purpose in life is an essential component of eudaimonic well-being. Because if I have a purpose in life, which includes other people, that I'm helping them, because then of course they help me, so it is good for my own well-being. But there's a meaning, and it's again I'm connecting that with a group, so it needs a good social connection. So it is not purpose by myself when I'm living in a cave. No, I'm living with some close people, family, other friends, colleagues, whatever it is. And then we have a joint purpose, but I also have my personal purpose that is related to that.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing is essential for our well-being, health, and even longevity. And I think right now, you're absolutely right. What is happening is it is not clear what the purpose is, because all the news we get is bad. Everything is worse. There is marked loneliness, and that's why people are more likely to become suicidal. People are more likely to be abusing substances. I mean, substance use has gone up so much, way beyond what anybody would have imagined.
Yeah.
Because you don't have a purpose and you take the drugs, so you don't have to worry about it. That's not a good solution at all.
Beautiful. I appreciate that, Dilip. And our time is flown by. And this final question, sometimes I feel bad asking it because we've kind of been talking about wisdom the whole conversation, but maybe it's an opportunity to sum things up, and put it in another way. So, how do you define or think about wisdom in daily life today?
I think the main point is, in our daily life, we need to have some sense of well-being. We need to feel good about ourselves. So that is what actually wisdom does. And feeling good does not necessarily mean that you are materialistically successful or otherwise. That's not the goal. The goal is, again, sort of talking about eudaimonic well-being, that you are happy because you're part of a group where you are helping one another. Yes, really good, high-quality social connections, because that actually provides a vaccine or antidote to something bad, crisis happening. Bad things are going to happen, no question about that, no matter what. As we age, the risk of physical diseases increases, risk of our close ones dying increases, and so many other things that can go wrong. But if we have that sense, purpose in life, if we have that eudaimonic well-being, we are working with others, that is wisdom.
Mm.
It is not really some specific achievements, but it is kind of sort of calmness, again, emotional regulation from that kind, self-reflection, accepting diverse outcomes, diverse perspectives. And so that gives you a sense of, as I said, calmness, well-being, that's really essential, especially in later life, but at any age, but especially in later life.
Beautiful. And your book Wiser, I think it's a must read. I can't recommend it enough. I quote it oftentimes in our newsletter that we do. So I appreciate you writing it. I appreciate your work in the world, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat about it. And I guess one thing to say in reference to that beautiful definition of wisdom and the antidote, it's like sometimes we want to wait till we're really in a bad spot or really in need of the antidote. It's like, how can we remember and maybe get excited about starting that project right now? It's like the idea of maybe learning to sail in rough waters is probably not the best environment to learn. How do we get excited and for that project of becoming wiser today? Any thoughts there?
You know, that's a very good question. Again, I think self-reflection, giving some time for that is critical. We go for physical exercise these days routinely. Most people do that. What about self-reflection exercise? How about deciding that 3 times a week we spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is, just self-reflecting, nobody else. And let us just think about the thing that happened in the past few days that made us feel stressed out and thing that made us happy. If we do that regularly, we start to understand ourselves better. We start to find out what things make us happy, what things make us stressed out. And then how can we do the right thing from that perspective? Because we have to feel good about us most of the time. And so we have to have the sense of well-being for us to survive and feel good. It's not the life. There's no point in going through life feeling stressed, angry, hatred, and so on. And we can get help from others that are close to us, and we can help them likewise. So really, there's this kind of self-reflection, and then we can actually make it broader self-reflection, including to other people in that. I mean, starting with our significant other, and then the closest friend, or so on and so forth. I think something like that would be helpful in feeling good, and also that will lead to better life and even greater longevity.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Dr. Jeste, thank you so much for coming back on In Search of Wisdom. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and you're doing a great job in your podcast. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much.